Today we're going to attempt a mini painting challenge where we try to fit as much detail as possible into a very small canvas. If you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the ebooks and a bunch of extra fun perks. But if you're interested, check it out. And with that, let's jump in, have some fun, and learn some things together. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water to extend the wet life of our paint and condense our bristles. With that, I'm going to head to my palette and grab an abundance of titanium white. We'll grab about a third of that in our Naples yellow, a third of that in our primary yellow, and a third of that in our cadmium red medium hue. Then we'll mix these up into a fairly nice peachy orange. We do want emphasis on the orange, so if you feel like it's not saturated enough, you can double down on these two. The Naples yellow is just to ensure it doesn't get too saturated too quickly. And from there, we'll start applying this mixture on the horizon of our tiny canvas. Then I'll make sure that we have a fairly horizontal line going across, but I'm not going to bring it up very high because the sky, the colors in it are going to change pretty dramatically. So I'm just cleaning my brush. Now head back to the palette, grab some titanium white, move that over here, grab a hint of Mars black to start desaturating this so that we can transition it into a blue. And typically you want your mixture to be a bit more pink and a bit more desaturated as you go from an orange to a blue. That way you don't have the yellow and the blue mixing and a bit of a green. So I'll grab a little bit more red, mix that into our new gray, work that on top of our previous mixture, just going back and forth. And you know what? I think we need to make it a bit brighter as well. We do want this to be a nice bright sky. Now we'll continue adding a bit more titanium white, hint more of that Mars black, keep it bright, nice and bright. Add that right on top. We'll do a subtle blend down. Try to avoid getting too many streaks in your strokes, and you can avoid that by not applying much pressure with the brush. Then we'll transition into our blue by grabbing some ultramarine blue, working that into the current mixture, applying that on top of our gray, reddish gray. And we'll do a little blend, not only horizontally, but downwards into the rest of that. We'll double down on our blue, but we don't want it to be too saturated. So we'll grab some Mars black and titanium white. Come back up to the top. And I'm going to need significantly more paint to stretch across the sky. You don't really want to drag it and thin it out to the point where you can really see the canvas underneath. So we'll do some remixing. You can see the transition of the sky on the palette. Just like that. Blend it down into the gray. And soften everything by going back and forth myriad of times. Now we'll switch over to our filbert brush because the rounded corners make for great blends and subjects like clouds. Now we want our clouds to be akin to this color right here, so we'll start with that on our palette, but we'll interject some extra titanium white to brighten it, and I do want to make it slightly more pink because we're layering it on top of a blue, which again can turn into a green if our mixture is too much yellow. So here we have a nice mixture. Might add a hint of Mars Black just so it's not too bright. You can see I'm taking off the excess on the rest of my palette. And now I'm going to go in towards the top here. And I like to start towards the middle of my cloud rather than on an edge. That way I can slowly feather it out using the edge of my brush, and as you can see, start to get a really nice, soft and transparent edge when I want it, but a sharper edge, like right up here, when I want that as well. And that's because the top of the brush is nice and sharp, so you can really dance back and forth between your two options there. And your cloud really should be a combination of sharp and soft markings. The bottom of the cloud, for the most part, as you can see, is soft, and it's blending down almost into that warmer pigment towards the bottom. Just like that. I'm going to clean my brush so I get the excess paint off. We'll go back, we'll grab more. It's important that we have some water on our brush so that we can get those nice semi-transparent applications. Here I have quite a bit of water on my brush, so I'm getting a very thin cloud, at least on the outskirts, which is what I want. And if you're not sure if you want a cloud to be really transparent or thick, opt for transparent first and then build it up over time. You can have two more clouds over here. I'm just looking at the reference photo and how it all kind of builds together. It's very subtle, which is nice. I have another one over here, and then just some playful markings towards the left-hand side. That'll look nice and cohesive. But I actually do want to start moving this cloud lightly down into this base. And now it doesn't look like it has an end, so it creates this depth where it just gets farther and farther away. Very easy, very simple. And actually, I like this pigment to the point where I want to apply it to the bottom and just make it a little bit of a less harsh orange. Acrylic paintings are innately done in so many layers. They need them, you need to build it up so you get something nice and professional. So if you don't like the color the first time, you can edit it and augment it throughout the process. I was quite happy with the bottom, but I really like that. I think it's soft and quite beautiful. So with that, almost happy with the sky, we're going to add a little bit of a golden yellow cloud towards the bottom, grabbing Naples yellow and our cadmium yellow, about an equal mixture of both. We're going for the most yellow mixture yet, and we're avoiding blues so we don't have to worry about greens. We'll still add a small hint of our red, but very minuscule amount. And we'll just throw this down here. It's getting lost behind the trees. We can add some subtle bumps in the cloud just to give it some form. And we also need the sun, which will be that color plus additional titanium white. And that can go right here. I'm going to take off all additional pigment. I'm going to do a little feathering with the edge of my brush. So very soft taps and drags. And you can see that we lost the hard marking. Grab a little bit of that pigment, work it into the top and left-hand side of this cloud. And then just work it down. Again, do a little blending. It's looking quite nice. Though, it's time for our next step. So for the next step, we're going to mix up a color for our trees, but we're actually not going to use a green. In the background, we have a lot of oranges and this warm light reflecting down onto the trees, and so we're actually going to start with a little bit of Mars Black, some of our Cadmium Red medium hue, about an equal amount, and then we'll also grab about an equal amount of our yellow. We'll brighten it up slightly with titanium white, and what we're really looking to accomplish here is essentially a very dark desaturated orange, because again, the subject, the trees, are so far away, we're not going to see their natural color, we're going to see the light that reflects onto them. That's a nice brown, it's good and earthy. We'll just get a little bit more color into it, make it darker. And that should work quite nice. I'll do a test on my reference photo. It's not really an orange, but it looks like what we're looking for. Now, towards the tops of all of our hills and mountains in the background, we're going to start with a lot of vertical markings using very little pressure with our brush. And I'll get you a lot closer for this. So, yet again, a lot closer, using as little pressure as I can. And you can see that I'm not worried about the bottom of the trees, I'm just looking at the tops. We're going to expand the detail using a different brush, but right now we're looking for an inconsistency within how these protrude. We want some higher, some lower. I'm going to grab a good amount of water on my brush, which will thin our paint dramatically to the point where we'll probably have to go over it a couple of times, but it'll let us get these sharper markings. And that's what really matters right now. Also, we want to, rather than having a flat backing, I want there to be a little bit of a hill that comes down, and then it gets high, and then it'll get low, and then it'll get high, and then it'll get low. So much like the trees, we're looking for inconsistencies within the land itself. And you can see that these markings are even better than the ones we did before. Why? Because we had a little bit of practice. That just goes to show it's okay to cover up or redo areas, because it'll probably be a lot better the second time. Now we're just going to move down here. We're actually getting farther away. The mountains move like this. So we're going to see less and less detail as we get into the back, which is why you can see that they're protruding not as high. There we go. Once we have that line in there, we'll grab an abundance of our pigment. And we can just fill in this area. We're going to have mist on the bottom. This is far too thin. You can see the canvas showing through. It's okay. We will do another layer once it dries. And we'll also continue this over here. I'm just doing a little bit of drawing with my brush rather than actual mark making, because while these are farther away, we still want that same application style. We still want it to be consistent. These details are minor. They probably won't be noticed when the painting is done, but subconsciously it will help. And then we get back to building. We can have the occasional higher tree. You can see how we have a nice dip. I'll get the camera a little bit farther back though, so you can have a larger context for how it's all moving. So here we are, a little bit farther back, and initially we did begin by working on the tops of the trees. I just want to show you that there are multiple ways of going about this, and what we can do is actually just craft the bottom, fill in this larger area of negative space, use an abundance of paint, not too much water. That way you can see how much thicker this is than that layer, because we haven't had to commit to the water because we haven't started doing the tops of the trees. Also, while we're here, we can test if that's dry, and if it is, we can grab more paint and work that down over here. Your acrylic paintings will look a lot more professional with second and third layers. And now we'll head back over there, grabbing our brush, using my pinky finger to ground my hand. So I eliminate shake, as this is an area that does require that real attention to detail. There we go. And this is another area that I want to change so that it's kind of highest right here, and then it gets lower towards both sides for the most part. This will be covered by additional trees, so you don't have to worry about it too much. Also, I apologize if my hand occasionally covers what I'm painting. I'm not used to doing such a small piece. This is the start of our new series here. And I really wanted to start a series where we worked on something smaller because realistically, we don't all have space to store 100 large canvases. And when you like to paint, you quickly end up with 100 paintings. It's also nice to test colors without committing just a wild amount of hours to get familiar with the subject. But because we're painting it with so much detail, it's also something that if you really like, you can paint on a larger canvas and it'll translate really well with the same techniques. So if you do love the image, you're more than welcome to work on something much larger. The techniques will be quite similar, but we're now switching to a new brush, that being the liner brush. I'm going to make this very damp so that we condense all of our bristles. We have something nice and sharp. We'll grab that pigment, and this is where we're going to craft individual trees. So we've started to make prominent ones. This is where we build them out. Like that. It's tiny, it's subtle. I know you're quite far away with the camera, so you're not really seeing a lot of the detail that's being implemented, but I want you to step back there for a second and just see how small these are in relation to the canvas and how well you should see it from that distance. Because it's really easy to go in and start doing this and make them far too large when you're focusing on the application style. So I just want to really reinforce how small they are despite the detail. And when I'm done this one, I will get you closer. So here we are, embellishing past trees. I typically like to start by elongating the top of a tree, and then I'll work out to the left and right hand side, bouncing back and forth, but ensuring that it's not symmetrical on both sides, because that will quickly look very unnatural. Going to go back, grab some extra water. Much like the crafting of these hills, we want to ensure that we're dramatically changing how close these trees are to one another. So these are all fairly solitary. I wanted to put one right beside this to start changing that up, right? The details are minute, and the results are subtle, but they build. You don't have to do this with all of your markings and all of your trees. It can just be select ones. And I will have a very detailed rendition of them in the traceable, which of course I will put up over on Patreon.
where you can also get access to the ebooks, the exclusive Facebook group, a bunch of bonus lessons, traceables, all of that good stuff. There we go. Now we're going to move over to the center and right-hand side. I can see that there are quite a few notable protruding trees towards the center, which is really nice because that's where we have those yellow clouds, and the difference between the silhouetted trees that we have here and those clouds will really stand out. It'll make these much more prominent. I'm also using slightly more water in my mix to apply these because I want them to be slightly more semi-transparent, so it looks like the light is really working through the trees. Just like that. Very good. We'll continue up that hill, but towards the right in the reference photo, it's quite notable how few protruding trees there actually are. And I'm going to honor that look so that I don't overdo things. Also, we can always go back and add more. But I'm going to keep this side more subtle than the left-hand side. And realistically, you just don't see as many trees and as many details in this side in comparison to that one because this one's just farther away. But I do still want all of my markings and edges to be clean, and this brush can render cleaner edges than the 1/3 inch filbert. Now we're going to start building out some mist. We'll do so with the 1/3 inch filbert brush because we do want those semi-transparent rounded applications. And I'm going to begin by rendering a nice, relatively saturated orange, certainly more so than what we've had in the past. So I'll begin with an equal mixture of our cadmium yellow and our cadmium red, leaving out the Naples yellow in the initial mix because that highly desaturates what we're working with. I'll grab some titanium white to thicken it up because the yellow and the red alone will be far too thin pigments. We'll grab a hint of Mars black, and I do mean a hint, the smallest possible amount just to desaturate it a little bit. We can also use a little bit of our Naples yellow to accomplish something similar. With that, the mist is going to be rolling in through this area, and it's going to be getting a lot of light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try my best to work on top of our applied trees, and you can go back and do this later and really get the details using a liner brush for the tops of them, but I'm going to do my best with this right here. It all depends on your comfort level with the brush and your ability to apply that paint. There's nothing wrong with either method as long as you are happy with your results. But as you can see, we start off in that middle area. It already creates some depth. It kind of looks like it's being pushed back a little bit. Then we're going to continue moving our way forward. And again, I'm trying to manage my hand so that it doesn't get in front of what we're doing for you. And I want it to start dissipating as we move towards the left-hand side. We're getting farther away from the light, and so its impact, its reach, is going to lessen, right? So we'll make it nice and opaque towards the middle, going over it a couple times, and then we have our soft gradient. But we have mist. And that mist is going to have its own unique shapes. So with that, I'm going to paint them in on top of that gradient. And give it some unique features. It's much like the clouds where you want some portions to be soft, some to be hard. There's a general movement there. But we're not just painting in this warm pigment, because there's also going to be mist that doesn't have any direct sunlight, and it's going to be much cooler. So what we're going to do for that is we'll grab our titanium white, Mars black, significantly less Mars black, by the way, our ultramarine blue, and we want a bluish gray. Don't want it to be too blue. If anything, it should be less saturated than the orange. I'll do a little test on my reference photo. I did print that out. And maybe we'll add a hint of red just so it transitions well with the orange. Now, from there, I'm going to start applying this towards the bottom. And this is actually going to stretch all the way over here. I'm just getting an idea of where I want it to be first. And then I start to work our way up into some of that mist. And you want it to be a gradient from this blue into the orange that we have. We don't want too much there though. There we go. We're also going to take some of this and we're going to apply it over on the right hand side because the light is going that way, and this will have a lot of that more cool, soft mist. Let's get you a little bit closer and brighten up the pigment. So now we're going to grab some extra titanium white, work that into our bluish gray. I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground it on the canvas to eliminate shake. Apply this to the base of our mist. And then we can just move it up very softly, get that clean gradient, have some areas higher than others. I'm going to go back, grab a watery mixture, and then we can make it a little bit wispy. That's too much water. So that we have all of these fun markings, create new patterns, just like that. Now acrylic's dry, a little bit darker than when they're applied, so I'm going to grab more titanium white, rework that into the base, and you can see we're just slowly building it up. You can add hints of it in the higher mist, but you don't want too much because you do want that gradient. Now over here, we also could use that slightly brighter variant, just like that. Do a subtle transition upwards. We're going to have to go back in and reincorporate more orange. That's okay. Though, make sure you clean your brush well before you go back to recreate and mix this orange, because you really don't want blue in your brush when you're working with the yellow. Again, we'll use a bit more of the Naples yellow than we did the first time, because I do want it to be thicker. And then I'm just going to double down on the primary yellow and primary red. Try to get the majority of that off my brush, because we don't want too much. Head back down into these trees, start in the brightest area, the one that's going to be receiving the most light. Then start to work towards the left. Let it naturally dissipate. As you get over there, you can see that there are lots of tops of the trees that I definitely need to go back to and work on using a liner brush. That's all part of the process. And I'm going to get the tops of these in the gradient done first before I do a lot of mixing down into the bluish gray. Just because I don't want to dilute the pigment before I do this top section. Once I have that done though, I can grab this. We'll start again in the middle just so we have the majority of our paint off our brush, and we can do a subtle blend out over here. Again, make it a little bit wispy. If you overdo your mist, it's okay. You just go back in with the color that you had for the trees. Let me just do a little bit of a blend down. That said, I'm going to put that brush down, grab my liner, make sure it's damp, grab our pigment, and then just do some touch-ups towards the tops of these trees that were a little too tiny to deal with appropriately when working with the 1/3 inch filbert brush. There we go. Feeling nice and warm. That light is just escaping over the trees. It's dissipating. It's looking natural. That said, what isn't looking natural is we almost have a hard line right there of light. So I'll go in with a fairly watery mixture. And I'll just make sure we have a nice gradient. There we go. That'll dry a little bit darker, but it'll feel more cohesive. Now, as you can probably see, I went ahead and just drew in a couple of trees. Again, they'll be far more detailed in the traceable, but I just wanted to give myself an idea of where things were going because we painted over it. With that, we're going to work on the landmass in the middle of the water and the trees. We're going to do so with a slightly darker version of what we have over here. So I'm beginning with Mars Black and quite an abundance of it, because we need a lot of area to cover. Grab a little bit of titanium white to make sure that it's not a pure black. We'll grab our Naples yellow, our red. This is really a combination of all of our warmer hues. That technically is a warm blue, ultramarine, but for now, this should work well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start crafting the land. Not going to worry too much about the foliage, about the bushes. I just want the general bumps and movements that comprise the area in which we are painting, because they do matter. We don't want it to be a flat patch of land. It can be much more interesting than that. So we'll just work through this. You can see that I'm tackling the top of it first as well. It's very intentional. The bottom, we're going to be doing water and reflections, a lot of different techniques which will augment it. So it doesn't matter too much at this point, but this top portion does, because we have the background finished and we want a nice clean application with it. As we get over here, we get towards these trees, and I begin to paint vertically. And I'm just going to block in the bases of these trees. And they actually get higher and higher as we move, or the larger base, the larger cluster gets higher and higher as we move towards the right. However, there is still a couple of trees that protrude that are larger. And this will cover our mist in its entirety on the right-hand side, just like so. Grab a bit more of that dark pigment, and then I'll start to paint in the bottom. Again, this area doesn't matter too much, but we do want to start getting an idea of how it's going to move. So you can see that it dips out and then it dips back in again. That creates a little bit of depth. And then I'm just filling this in using the larger body of the brush. Initially, when I create those lines, I only use the top sharp point of it, but there of course is a lot of excess paint on the rest of the brush. So that's when you just apply more pressure. And remember, whenever you want a small marking, there are going to be a lot of them if you're painting this small, apply as little pressure as possible. And then, when you're filling in areas, you can apply more. Just a good general rule. That said, let's get you a little bit closer so we can start crafting in some of the grass and the more important parts of the trees. Now, the first step is, again, the grass. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab some of this pigment. I'm going to go right above our lines, and then either horizontally or vertically, I'm going to do these little taps. And it's just going to give us the smallest impressions. Don't want anything big. And I'm doing this with a fairly wet brush. We'll condense our bristles so that the vertical application style that I'm currently doing works really well. But it's worth noting that if you keep your brush a bit more dry and you go like this, you'll get a lot of different markings because the bristles won't be condensed together. It's the water that condenses them for the most part. So there are a couple of different methods. It depends on what you like, what you are more comfortable with. But this brush set will be coming out fairly soon, so this is how I prefer to do it with this set in particular. There we go. Very subtle. All right. Now, I want this to be a bit of a bush. Could be the beginning of a tree. So I'll make that a little bit higher, and then I'll let it have some pieces that kind of move out a little bit. Just like that. We're going to have another tree right over here. Trying to make these markings as small as I can. Then have the branches come out. Nice and tiny, right? This one, I'm going to start in the middle of the tree, work my way down, applying as little pressure as I can. I want this to be tiny. Again, trying to keep my hand out of the way. Doing my best. There we go. And then we also have a couple subtle trees over here. The majority of my paint has worn off, so I'm working with a very watery mixture, which is great because it makes these ones look farther away, maybe a little bit in the distance, maybe a little bit in the mist. There we go. And we'll even paint one over here, being very mindful of the fact that we have a fairly bright backing for it. So whatever we paint will be quite noticeable. So we'll try our best, make it look quite nice. Again, trying to create variety when we move to the left and right. There we go. Now, we need to work on these, but I want to do it with something a little bit different than this brush and even the mixture that we're currently using. That said, I can tell that I was about to move on, and when I saw, you know what, in the reference photo, there could be a little something right there. Yeah, that's it. That's good. One of those things where you think you're done, and then you look back and it's, oh, you know, there are a couple more opportunities to make this even better. That's great. There's a little leaning tree. I like that. Let's switch our brush and our mix. Now, I've actually decided to keep the filbert brush for mixing because it can just mix significantly more paint than the liner. And what I want to do right now is grab some red. We're going to mix beside our last application. Naples yellow, little bit of our cadmium yellow, not much though. The majority of the yellow in this mix I want to be Naples because we're going to use quite a bit of Mars black in it, and I don't want it to turn into a green immediately. Now we'll grab a small amount of Mars black because we don't need much. Mars black is by far the strongest pigment that we have on our palette, and it will quickly overwhelm the other pigments. So we will be careful, slowly interject it, and then we'll make it a little bit more orange, red, Naples yellow, and it has a real red base, so I'm not too afraid right now of adding in a little bit of yellow. There we go. We'll put this brush down, pick up the liner, make sure it is nice and damp, grab that pigment, and this is what I'm going to use for the tops of these trees. Why is this color different? Because we have the light working our way around these trees. And we're just going to blend it down into the halfway point of the darker mixture so that we have a natural progression of light on the top that eventually lessens into the dark silhouette of the bottom. I'm going to go over this a couple of times because we're using a lot of water. Now for the actual applications, we're going to be very meticulous. We're not just going to throw these on quickly. You can see that they extend in different trajectories, different angles, and that typically they get bigger as we work our way down the tree, right? We can leave openings in between them, so we're not fully filling it out. But we can also have areas where it gets really full, like right here, because there are a bunch of branches which are overlapping. But we need to be careful about going back and forth between these techniques. So here is another larger opening, not present in the reference photo, but I am taking an artistic liberty because I think it will aid the piece. It's an important lesson. Reference photos, traceables, it's all great to get you started, to give you a base, to show you something that you innately wouldn't think of, right? I think a lot of us break subjects, trees, mountains, clouds down into something definitive when there's so many different variants and ways of going about it that you don't really realize until you're looking at a reference photo or traceable. And that's why they're great. But we're making art, and it's okay to make your art your way. So don't feel like you have to copy a reference photo, a traceable, what I'm doing. You can take it in your own direction if you feel inspired, and that is a-okay. All of these are guides and aids to help you, not to restrict you. With that, tree number 1 turned out pretty nice. We can go back and add more to it, but I don't want to yet because I want to see how the rest of the painting progresses. That's important. The balance of all of the trees will have more of an impact on the final piece than the detail on an individual tree. So while you could make a tree incredibly detailed and brilliant and really stand out, if it means that the other trees don't match it, or that you have to elaborate on the other trees to the point where it's just too much, the painting will suffer. So we slowly add that detail over time as we build up. I want these trees to be a little bit higher. They're not in the reference photo, but again, I am no stranger to artistic liberties. There we go. I think that looks nice. We have a very large sky, So I just want to balance it. We'll grab more of that paint. We'll head over here. I can tell that the branches for this one are a little bit different. They kind of arc like this, where the other ones are much more elongated. And I like that. But we need to make sure that it's not different to the point where it doesn't visually make sense next to the ones that we've already established. So, we take our time. You can tell that I'm really running out of paint. There's a lot of water on here. That's okay. We're about to change our mix anyway. Again, I raised the other two, so I should raise this one. Something else I'm trying to avoid is having them all be the same height. I want this one to be the highest, that one to be the second highest, that one to be the third highest. It doesn't have to be dramatically different, but it should be different. It'll just look a lot better, a lot more natural. Okay. Now, we're going to grab some Mars Black. That hurts a lot. And we're going to make a brighter variant, or a darker variant rather, of what we are currently working with. So I'm going to mix it right beside, that way I can use my current mix as an example and make sure that I'm moving in the right direction with it. Something I typically try to do is, if I know I'm going to need another pigment again, I try to leave a little bit of it on the palette so that I can remix to it later with greater ease. Now, we can work our way up the tree again, but we're going to be careful not to go too high, and we're just really doing this in the most dense areas essentially. And we're bringing that back down to the rest of our silhouette. Really hoping my hand isn't in the way. Been doing this for, it feels like a decade at this point. Recording the videos and painting them. But sometimes when you switch size of your canvas, there's a really big impact. Also, I really hope this lesson shows that just because you're working with a small canvas doesn't mean that you can't put time and effort into it. Doesn't mean that we just blaze through it. I'm sure this lesson will still take quite some time, and that's okay. But it won't be a 4-hour long lesson like what I've been posting recently. So or 3 hours, but it won't be too inaccessible for those without time. Something I really wanted to do with this series was just make things so that if you only had an hour in the week, you could still watch one of these and get a good lesson, learn how to do what you want to do, work on a painting with me. Because I know that the larger canvases can be quite a time commitment, which isn't a bad thing. Learning how to paint, really putting the time in, but I think a balance is nice. Now, heading in to the right-hand side, we're going to grab more of the same darker mix that we used over towards the center. And we're going to start crafting unique trees that sit at different heights. Again, this one is going to be quite tall. Start with its body. And then I'll work my way back up towards the top, where I'll try to keep it fairly airy, starting with a lot of openings. If I want to fill in an area, I can. But of course, as we get towards the bottom, we need to expand to a greater degree. It means more branches will probably cross one another, so there will be less openings, but we still want to be somewhat cautious, right? And the more little sharp impressions we can render, the more natural it'll look. These trees are fairly far away, but we will still be able to see detail within them. Grab a bit more. You can also probably tell just how watery this mix is. And that does mean that there are certain parts that we will have to do a second layer of. But that's a-okay. We don't want this to be as detailed as the center, and we don't have light moving through it in the same way. So we can stick with more of a silhouetted look. And that's a good thing because you don't want the eye to be too distracted and to be brought towards the edge of the canvas where it may then leave. You want to keep the attention towards the center and your main subjects. Now it's time to start working on a much larger area. So we are switching back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, making sure it is nice and damp. Now, here we're working on the reflection. There's going to be a lot going on, but we want the most simple base layer to work on top of, very much like the sky. And the reflection that we're working on is that of the sky. So I'm going to begin in the same way that I did for the top area. We're going to grab an abundance of our Naples yellow, titanium white, a little bit of our primary, a little bit of our red. This is far too saturated, as we can see. So we need to desaturate it, add an abundance of titanium white, just like so. We can do a little test in the sky, make sure that it matches. It's a little bit brighter. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take a hint of Mars Black. You can see I'm taking off the excess. And I'm going to work that in there. Typically reflections are slightly darker than that of which they are reflecting. So, now we can start heading in. And I'm going to do this quite similarly to how we did the top, in that I start with this pigment. We work it horizontally. I attempt to keep my hand out of the way, but I make no promises. And we'll get a bit of a soft blend moving up here. So I'm working over it back and forth, not too much pressure, because I just don't want a hard line that I have to work over later when we incorporate additional reflections. I'm going to go over this twice just so that we have a nice thick application. Remember, acrylic paintings do look a whole lot better when they are well applied. Now we're going to move into more of a gray. So titanium white, Mars Black, a little more Mars Black, and we'll work that just looking at the reference photo right here. Definitely need significantly more paint. We can also add a hint of red. It'll be a good transition color between the blue and the orange. It's a little too dark. Again, you can test directly on the reference photo if you're unsure or concerned. Let's bring that into the yellow, just like so. And now we'll start working down with our blue. So we'll work that into our last mix. Make sure that your brush doesn't have any yellow on it when you do grab this blue though. Otherwise, again, you'll probably end up with a green. Also, you can see how chalky that looks. There's a lot of tooth in the canvas. We want to avoid that. The best way to do that is more paint and more layers. So I'll just make a bit more of that gray. Work that in. Go for the blend. Make it nice and cohesive. Now I'll continue moving down. Back to our blue. Maybe a hint of Mars black. Remember, it needs to be darker than the actual sky. Not by a lot, but to an extent. I like that pigment, but we need significantly more of it. Doing a lot of this wet into wet, you don't have to, but it does make it a little bit easier, which is why I'm working a bit more quickly, and I'm not changing the camera angle as much. I just want to accomplish as much as I can right now. Typically, I don't like to scrape my brush into the canvas as I am, and you can hear it if I be quiet. But this particular canvas isn't adopting paint extremely well, so it's just a little bit of a necessity. I'm using a lot of paint, and I have water on my brush, but it's fighting me a little bit. So this is something we do in those scenarios. Now, something else we're going to do with this reflection is have some movement in the water. And it's going to be very easy to accomplish initially. I'm just going to create some lines and apply less pressure as we get towards the left-hand side so that it can trail off. It's more opaque here, and then it gets less so. It's larger towards the base, and then it gets smaller. This is just a very small example of what we're going to do with the reflections, but it's a start. Now, I need to fill in this area again a bit better. There we go. Make it nice and gray. Can throw in a little bit of red if you'd like. And the canvas is fighting me a little bit, so we'll just apply a little bit of extra pressure. I'm going to have silhouettes and foliage here, so I don't actually need to finish up that area in particular. But now that I have this lighter pigment, I can create more dividing little ripples in the water, as you can see. And we can go back to a darker mixture. And we're just kind of going back and forth between the two. And as we get higher up, it turns into something that's much more horizontal. So we have an angle towards the bottom, and that changes as we go towards the top. Let's get a bit more of a gray, but let's this time have some of that warmer pigment. You can see I'm grabbing it from our pre-existing mix. Needs to be brighter. And this is something you can go back over many times until you get it the way you really want it. I feel like subtlety is really key. So I'm actually going to decrease the amount of movement, as you can see. Fairly watery mixture. There we go. And cleaning my brush fairly well because I want to go back to the Naples yellow mix. Interject a little bit more red. Just make it slightly more peachy. Now, while I'm doing this, an alarm for dinner may go off. If that occurs, don't be alarmed. And I'd just like to note that it's important to remember to take your snack breaks, have your meals. Otherwise, your hands will get pretty shaky and painting will get a whole lot harder. We also just lose our patience when we're not well fed. So, use this as a reminder for that. Take little breaks and make sure that you're healthy while you're painting. There we go. It's looking quite nice. And that's the alarm. I am going to tend to that. Sorry. And then I'll be back. So here we are, a little bit farther back. It's been about 12 hours. I had some food, had a late night meeting, went to bed, and now here we are. Though it does look a little bit different because this is layer number 4 of doing the water. Did the exact same thing, just built up more paint over time until the point where it actually looked finished and professional. Thought about recording it, but I figured an extra half hour in the video of doing the same thing probably wasn't going to be that beneficial. So with that, we are going to proceed with the next step, which is taking the reflection of some of these clouds and interjecting them down into the water. We're going to do so with the 1/3 inch filbert brush, and I'm going to begin by grabbing some of our Naples yellow, primary yellow, or rather cadmium yellow, cadmium red. We'll need to make it very bright, titanium white, a little bit more yellow, but we need to be careful with the yellow because we are going to be placing it on top of blue, so it does need to be a bit more red dominant. Even if this is more yellow dominant, we can build up the yellow over time. But I don't want an abundance of paint, so I'm going to take off the excess on my brush, make sure my brush is damp, grab a little bit, find this, head down, say, okay, you know what, it looks like we probably have it right here. And it'll move back to that point. You can follow the highlighted areas of the water and avoid the darker little dips. And that'll give it a really natural, even flow to it. So we're not necessarily painting clouds, we're just painting the idea of them underneath where they are, the hue. There we go. We can grab a little bit more paint, build up the middle section, leave the edges to be semi-transparent, just like that. We have another one over there, but it might just be off view, and then we have hints of them over here and over here, but not too much. So far so good. Now let's start working on the tree line reflection. We'll grab some of our Mars black, Cad red, yellow, and burnt sienna. That of course will give us a nice earthy hue, quite dark. We'll add a hint of titanium white to desaturate it. And now we'll do a little test, make sure it's close to what we have there. It's a little bit too dark, extra titanium white. And that looks nice with the addition of some red. Lots of micro adjustments will make your painting a whole lot better over time. So now with these, I'm going to head underneath our fog, underneath our landmass, which will have fog in front of it over top of this reflection. So don't worry about this area too much. It's something that will get more layers of paint, different subjects layered on top, and it'll look a whole lot nicer. But for the meantime, we just need to cover that canvas. And we're going to continue doing so all the way over here. We're going to create the reflection for this, so it'll come down a little bit. Applying a little bit more pressure with my brush into the open negative space. And then we come to the reflection of these trees which we will need a bit of a darker pigment for, but I'll get the base now just to, again, fill out that bottom canvas area. With that, I think actually I want a little bit more Naples yellow. And when we go to create this reflection, I'm going to do it with a series of vertical strokes, looking for the tallest trees, trying to mirror them. Again, most of this is going to be augmented and covered, but we want to get a good base. And we're going to go in and do the real detail work with the liner brush anyway. But we do have a lot of surface area to cover, and the best way to get started is to use a slightly larger brush like the filbert and just get that paint on the canvas. Now here I'm going to do these entirely with the liner brush. So we'll just build up a little reflection here. We'll get you a little bit closer. Now, before I switch to the liner, something I do want to do is interject a little bit of warmth into this reflection. So we're going to take our Cad red and yellow very specifically, work beside our last mixture, interject a little bit of titanium white, even less Mars black. Do a little test up here. Okay, it's darker, but it's a nice hue. And we'll just let this dissipate from this center area as we get towards the left-hand side of the canvas. Have a little bit more vibrancy down here. I think it looks quite nice. And now, take this brush, put it to the side, switch to the liner brush, grab a bit more of that nice warmer highlight, and I'm going to apply this through horizontal strokes where the trees are and how they're protruding. So this is going to clean up a lot of the toothy aesthetic that we had with the last brush because we just couldn't get that level of detail. And then I'll go to the darker pigment as we move towards the left, but I'll continue that same technique of working predominantly horizontally. And we're just trying to add a little bit of movement to our water. Just like that. Lovely. That one looks good. Now we can move on to this larger one, which is going to be done very similarly in that it's horizontal strokes, starting with the darker color. But we want to be careful about how we progress with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to do all of the individual little markings initially. I'm going to try to place it in the canvas and make sure that it has the correct movement, because that is what's most important. It's not the detail, it's that it follows the right path. There we go. You can see that there's a slight bend in this that way, there's a slight bend in it this way. And then we can come back up and fill it in a little bit more once we have that general movement established. And we can do little pockets that stick out horizontally. There we are. By the way, we are going to go back and clean all of these up, so don't feel like what you are currently applying is the end of the reflection. It will get quite a lot better, but it's one of those things where we need patience. So again, new tree, starting by highlighting in the brighter areas of water, though we can deviate into the darker with these reflections. And then I build out. There's another little tree right here. You can see that my mix is quite watery at this point. Same color as that, but less pigment, more water. So it's semi-transparent to a greater degree. And we just need more paint. But I'm going to mix that with this brush. Yellow, red, Mars black, titanium white, and a lot more Mars black. Remember, we don't go with the first mixture we have, and we keep mixtures on our palette right beside so that we can remix with ease. See that? Now we have the actual color again. I'm just going to splash it elsewhere just a little bit to ensure that it is cohesive if it's a little bit different. So I'm trying to consider the movement of the branches, but portray most of them through horizontal strokes. And predominantly, though not exclusively, in the highlighted, more yellowish gold portions of the water. And down here, we have these little taps. Really dissipates. We have the little pieces that extend outwards on either side. They typically really do add a lot to the aesthetic. Just like that. I want to make it a little bit more full. So I'm going to go to the center. I'm just going to build out this area slightly more. Again, we can clean this up if you do a little bit too much or if it gets messy by just going in with this pigment and working horizontally. I'm going to go with the less is more approach right now. And work on these, then I can go back should we want to. And this one is fairly unobstructed from movement, unlike the ones to the left, which is nice. There we go. This is something that you really want to take steps back and look at from an afar to see the larger context and how it's all working together. It's easy to get caught up in the details up close, and I find that I'm doing that right now. And I'm craving a view at 5 or 6 feet back. I can use the viewfinder, but even the camera's a little bit far away right now. So I'm just not able to see this in the way that I want to yet. But we'll make it happen. And I'll just add these little touches before I do. So looking at it from back here, I think it passes the distance test. Let's get over to this side and start fixing that up. Now over here, I'm going to begin very simply by just touching up the reflection of these trees. And I'll do that predominantly through a vertical stroke, not a horizontal stroke, because they're not protruding to the point where you could see the winding of the water working through them. And this water's somewhat far away. So we'll just do that to start things off. Put that brush down, pick up our 1/3 inch filbert, make a darker variant of what we are currently working with, something akin to what we have up there. Maybe a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more cad red, yellow. Test. Looks great. But it's a reflection, so we can go slightly darker. Now, switching back to the liner. And we're going to apply these similarly to what we did over there. Not going to go overboard though. And I'm going to bring this pigment all the way up, because remember, this color that we brought over here is brighter than this, because this is closer to us and it doesn't have as much light working through it. And right now I'm just placing my trees, not elaborating on them or worrying about too much. Now we can go back in and fill it in. I'm going to be a little bit more loose with this area, though still mindful. I just don't want the attention to go and stay over here, because again, we want it more towards the center of our painting. So we might purposefully make this slightly less detailed. These trees are also farther away, so the reflection should be less detailed, but we're going to ensure that we remember that when instigating it. There we go. Nice and quick. Not bad at all. Now for our next step, we're going to make the transition between this area, this area, this area, and this area, as well as over here, significantly more natural. And we're going to do so by painting in a shallow water that leads up to this area. And what we're going to do is we'll grab some blue, titanium white, Mars black. We're essentially remixing to the pigment that we have right here. I can do a little test. I can tell that it's too bright. At this point, we have a lot of blues on the palette, so it's difficult to distinguish which one was used for this area, but that actually looks really nice. And when I go in to start applying this, I'm going to, with this brush, not do too much, but I'll just craft a little line that separates the land from the reflection. I'm doing it subtly, almost no pressure on my brush right now. And we're just bringing it all the way to the edge there, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'll switch my brush, clean that a little bit, make sure that the paint doesn't dry on it, to our liner brush. Make sure that it's nice and damp. I'm going to get in really tight, really close, make a great deal of horizontal lines that originate essentially from that initial line that we painted with the 1/3 inch, and they'll move downwards, but as they do, they're going to have space in between them, both beside each other and on top and below. We'll create a pattern of sorts, but not one that's easily distinguishable. And I know you're quite far away. Again, this is just one of those things where I wanted to show you the subtlety first, but worry not, you will get closer as we continue to layer this new application. And I think we can do that. Now, we don't want to pull it out too far. You can see that I'm avoiding the tops of these trees. So let's get in. Now for the second layer, I'm going to want to brighten up this mixture a little bit. So I'm going to add in some titanium white. Typically I don't like to mix with this brush, but we don't need a lot of paint, so it's not bad. And then I'm going to go over a lot of those markings that I already made. So you can see the pattern, you can see the spacing. You can see that it's tighter when it's closer to the land. And then as we get farther away, everything starts to space out. I'm using quite a bit of water, but I do want distinct markings. So all of these are semi-transparent. I'll probably have to go over them again as they dry. But I do want to wait until they dry. Otherwise, I likely won't really brighten it much. I'll just make the markings larger, which isn't what I want. I want them to be small. I want them to be concise. There we go. Heading back, more titanium white. Interject that into the blue. You can see progressively we're building it up, trying to move around quite dramatically with this technique, because I don't want to do too much of one thing in one area, just in case I'm subconsciously repeating a application, a stroke, something to the point where it'll be awkward and noticeable rather than natural and free-flowing. And as we start to work with these brighter pigments, do be careful not to overdo it. Do take those steps back, as it is easy to just enjoy this and add for very prolonged periods of time that aren't necessarily necessary. There we go. Now, something else we can do, provided our brush and water are clean, we can recreate some of that color that we used for the reflection of the sky. And I still have that in abundance here on the palette, so it's easy to remix too. But once we have that, as I was talking about earlier, if you overdo the reflection of these trees, you can go back in and you can cut highlights into them with horizontal markings, and these horizontal marks will match what you did up here quite nicely, and it'll just feel really cohesive. So I'm just spacing these out. You'll probably want to use water to thin it, but you don't want to use too much water because you still want these applications to be relatively thick. We're working a light pigment over a dark pigment, which with acrylics can be tricky. But I think that worked out really nicely, actually. Then I'm just throwing some extra little highlights here and there, further elaborating on movements within the water. Just like that. But we are not done. We are not done yet. So, next up, switching to the 1/3 inch filbert because we need to mix a larger amount of paint. And this is going to be a lot of Mars Black, about an equal mixture of our ultramarine blue and a little bit of our cadmium yellow. And then smallest hint of titanium white. The blue and the yellow together will make this into a bit more of a green, or at least something with a hint of a green, which is great for foliage that we want to incorporate in the foreground. So I'm going to get the majority of this pigment off my brush, put that aside, grab my liner, and start painting on some trees and foliage. Applying very minimal amounts of pressure. And again, all of this will be on the traceable, so you don't have to worry about it. But I would like to say a big thank you to everybody who's watched up into this point. It means a lot that you're supporting the new series, that you're enjoying the mini painting, which I thought would probably be a 45-minute video, but it's now quite evident that we're probably looking at 2 hours. Likely would have been a 4-hour video had I painted this at a normal size. And you can definitely paint it at a normal size if that's something that you're interested in. Just recognize that it'll take significantly longer to accomplish. That's okay though. I really like doing these miniature pieces though. I just moved to a new place, as you probably saw in the background at the start of the video. And when I started putting up paintings, I found myself inclined to put up a bunch of little ones rather than my larger pieces. And I thought, I haven't done anything smaller in a while, but they're great to do little accent pieces with, to decorate. You can create whole collections or themes and then put them up in a room or connect rooms through them. And it isn't too distracting because they're not large, right? So I really like miniature paintings from a decorative standpoint. And I really like them from the fact that you can still incorporate so much detail and realism, but they don't take up a quarter of as much space. So for someone like me who lives in a condo in the city, that is wonderful. But in addition to that, you get to test color palettes, compositions, scenes so much more quickly. So I'm very much enjoying this. Following the reference photo now, for the most part. We have different types of foliage towards the bottom here. Slowly making that area a little bit bigger. Do some stems with some draping leaves. Subtlety is definitely the key here. And the more I expand towards the left, the more I realize I can build up in the middle. So we're taking it slow. And we're finding the right compositions. We definitely have some smaller markings down here. I'm going to be a bit more loose with my application of this because it doesn't have too much of a definitive form, We can frame this tree by having some on the left and some on the right hand side. I like that, just naturally occurred. Over towards the right, we start to incorporate more grasses. And we can also have pieces that connect visually with what we have over on the left-hand side. But we've been doing a lot of this from a bit of a distance. I'll get you closer and we'll continue. Now, we have a lot of negative space, and how I actually want to approach that initially is with the 1/3 inch filbert, just because we can save probably 2 to 3 minutes by blocking this area in. I'm going to leave a little bit of an opening here towards the middle. That way we can just have some areas that aren't as full. You can see that there's a real change in the trajectory of a lot of it, and then it winds down into there. So we kind of have a vignette wrapping around the edge of the canvas, and it actually connects up into that, but I'll save the application there for the liner brush. With that, we'll clean off the 1/3 inch, switch to the liner, grab some of our pigment, and then start creating lots of little petals and stems that can originate from these larger clusters. I'm thinking about leading lines. A lot of my petals are leaning in towards the left-hand side, where these ones leaned in towards the right, and the idea is just that we're pushing the eye visually towards the center, subconsciously, for the most part. Now, these markings can be larger or smaller. I'm going to do a combination of the two. It's going to create a little bit of depth in the silhouette to show that some are slightly farther away, but it'll also give us variance, make it look like there are portions of the greenery that are maybe a little bit younger, still growing. There we go. And then we lead our way up. There we go. Filling in that open spot, connecting it to our trees ahead. Do make sure that you have a nice thick application for a lot of this. It's in the foreground, it's noticeable, it should be sharp, it should be detailed. Arguably the most detailed area we have the opportunity to do down here, because it's closest to us and it just makes sense that you would visually see the most amount of detail. So I'm going to go in and I'll paint some individual little leaves, give them a bit more character than what I initially incorporated. But it's really bringing this piece together. There we go. Like that. So here we are, a little bit farther away. I think that the bottom is coming along quite nicely, but there are some things we have to go back and work on, like the reflection from these trees in particular, and a little bit of mist that is yet to be added. So, with that, as I like to say in every video, big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making this lesson happen, getting us here. These lessons would not happen if it wasn't for you and your support. I'm incredibly grateful that I get to make these painting lessons each week because of you. And I know I say it every video, and maybe it gets annoying, but I feel like it's important. So, big thank you for also just providing me with the opportunity to experiment artistically with these series, make things like this happen as well, be a little bit more risky with the content creation. And again, not worry too much about the time, because realistically on YouTube, videos really tend to succeed when they're shorter. So if you do like a time-lapse painting, something that's 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, it'll likely do quite a bit better. But it's because of you that we can do videos that take 1-2 hours. Again, I was kind of hoping this would take maybe around 40 minutes. Not because of the algorithm or anything, but more so just so that it was more accessible and a greater number of people would have time to complete it. But I think that the first priority should be making a great painting and a great lesson. So we take the extra time and we make it happen when we need to, though I will try to make the future ones a little bit shorter for accessibility. But I do, again, just really appreciate the support on the channel, on the Patreon, that allows us to paint and do lessons that are far longer than what is probably optimal for getting these videos out there. Not having me rely on AdSense and whatnot. So, big thank you. Right now, I'm just reincorporating the reflection into those blue markings, keeping some of them, but not all of them, and building up the center of these trees with the darker mixture that's used in the center. And I will also note, for anybody who might be new to the channel, maybe this is the first video here. If so, welcome. I hope you've been enjoying. But if it is that first video, and you are unfamiliar, up over on Patreon, you can get the traceable, so a digital sketch of this to help you with the drawing process, if perhaps you just want to focus on the painting. There are gridded versions. It's something you can print out or use with a mini projector, or you can freehand sketch it once you see the drawing and all of that. But you can also get pictures of all of the paints and materials that I'm using when they're posted. You can also find things like the reference photo, a bunch of ebooks, one of which is called Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it, we talk about what brushes to use, how to work with water, using different colors and blends and color palettes. Also a bunch of ebooks full of traceables. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their artwork and their renditions, so you get to see a lot of different versions of these. Get to ask fellow artists how different things could be improved, or just get general positive feedback. It's a wonderful community. Every time I jump in there, I am impressed by just how everybody supports each other. And up on Patreon, you can also get a bunch of bonus lessons. I have a couple series of 24 by 36 inch canvases, so big lessons, medium-sized lessons. Maybe soon some bonus ones like this. But it's worth checking out. There's a link in the video description if you're interested. And to everybody who already signed up, big thank you. That said, I want to do a little bit more mist. I'm going to put this brush down. I'm going to pick up the 1/3 because again it has that nice rounded edge. I'm going to make sure it's nice and clean. The last time I used it, it had green on it, which I really don't want in this next mix. And this next mix is blue heavy, titanium white heavy, and Mars black heavy. We are remaking the color for the mist that we used over here. We'll do a little test. Looks like we found it nice and quickly. But I'm going to take off the excess on a little cloth. Come back in, grab a bit of a watery mixture. I'm going to touch up some of this in the background. And then with what's left, I'll create a little bit of extra mist that can kind of roll along the water in front of this landmass. You can use your finger to soften it if you want, but if you do that, make sure that your finger is fully clean. So you washed it recently with soap. You don't want the oils from your hand getting onto the canvas, as that can unfortunately make it so that the canvas doesn't really adopt paint well. Towards the end of a painting, it doesn't matter too much, but you never know if you want to go back and change something. So if you do that, just make sure your hands are clean. I'm going to go back into the middle, thicken it just a little bit. Give this a nice misty right hand side of the painting. It can soften as we get towards the center, just like that. Now we have the nice warm light, the cool light, combination of the two, and just like that, I think we've completed our painting. I hope you had a lovely time. I hope that you feel inspired, that you end up creating something that you love, that you're proud to present. And I'd love to know in the comments what you think of the new series idea, what you think of potential lengths, if you like that we did it in the same format that we normally do the larger, longer videos. Would just love some feedback. Typically we do a keyword at the end of the videos where it's kind of a way for everybody to note just that they've kind of made it to the end, that they're part of that 13% that typically does make it to the end of the video. And today, instead of a keyword, I would just love to hear your thoughts on the new series and how it should move forward. So, thank you for being here. We will talk very soon. These are quicker to make, so I can make more videos like this. But yeah, you have a lovely day, and I'll see you soon. Stay creative.